Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, there's nothing democratic about these socialists, in parentheses, nearly half of the DSA's highest leadership body openly identify as communists, hosted by Lemon Limelight, and that's a cross-post from the Classical Liberalism subreddit, and they shared from The Atlantic, it's true that the DSA, Democratic Socialist America, has areas of ideological overlap with the Democratic Party, and would at least directionally support classic democratic policies such as higher minimum wage, defending social spending, and opposing the Trump administration. But DSA's version of democratic socialism goes far beyond routine public functions such as garbage collection and Social Security, which most Republicans, not to mention Democrats, support, or even aspirational policies such as Medicare for All. The DSPA has become more liberal and more dogmatic. A decade ago, the excitement generated by the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign on the left and the frightening rise of Donald Trump spurred an influx of tens of thousands of young members. Some of the new recruits from Marxist-Leninist organizers who saw the DSA's growing membership as fertile ground. Sectarian conflict broke out among rival factions vying to steer the group's suddenly growing membership. In 2018, some of the DSA's older activists formed the North Star Caucus, an internal group to defend anti-authoritarian principles from its newer authoritarian-minded entrants. The DSA's Red Star Caucus was formed the year after the North Star Caucus. It is an apparent rebuke. It writes in 2024 that nearly half of the members of the National Political Committee, the DSA's highest leadership body, openly identifies communists. These left-wing factions have regained the organization and relying the organization firm opposition to liberal democracy. What the DSA demands for the Democrats is not merely to advocate more generous social policies or more cautious foreign affairs, but to welcome or at least accept authoritarians as their coalition partners. Democrats are likely to face the same kind of pressure that Republicans fronted with MAGA's hostile takeover, first to ignore their allies' sinister goals and then to rationalize and eventually justify them. As authoritarian elements gain strength, they become more essential to the success of a political coalition, and the price of confronting them rises. The Republican Party has long since passed the point of no return. The easiest time to draw clear moral lines against the encroachment of liberalism with one's own camp is at the beginning. And yeah, personally, I guess I would kind of agree with all that. Personally, as I shared in another recent comment on Reddit, democratic socialism is just voting yourself into the gulag. With that being said, if people want to vote to enable these people, I think ultimately they have the ability to justify that. Personally, I think it's just to show the folly of forced collectivism. People are just going to gravitate towards the extremes a lot of the time, and you're pretty much stuck with either MAGA fascism or woke communism. And I don't think that's the libertarian position. I think libertarian positions, if you want to live in a voluntary community that practices MAGA fascism, woke communism, or whatever it wants to, you should be able to. But right now, you're forced to participate in a system where those in positions of government authority can enforce whatever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ideally, we'd have voluntary collectives rather than a single force collective. If a voluntary collective wants to practice communism or capitalism or whatever system it wants to, it should be able to. But right now, you're pretty much all forced to completely participate in the same collective, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it if you don't like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Clarence Thomas doubled down on presidential power from Reason.com, posted by Jay Porcupine. Yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But of course, Reddit, they love government power when it's Democratic power, but when it's Republican power, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Just go to show you, a lot of people have no principles, only teams. You just gotta be against whichever branch of the uniparty's in power, regardless of whether it's the red side or the blue side. It reminds me of another Reddit comment I recently made. I said classic Reddit response: red Epstein class bad, blue Epstein class good. They're all pretty much. It's, as George Carlin famously said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. If you if you're truly principled, you're going to end up getting kicked out of it as well, like Thomas Massey, and that's something I think is important to remember as well. Just because the people in positions of authority might make it seem like they're always on the verge of fisticuffs with each other because of wedge issues like abortion or LGBTQ, whatever other letters they've had as well, rights, doesn't mean they actually are. I think they agree on pretty much everything to support the ruling class elites that is themselves, while going after the common man. And oftentimes, that's why they started pushing all this identity politics stuff, because back in the early 2010s, the Occupy Wall Wall Street, which says all our problems are a result of big government or big business, and then the Tea Party, which says all our problems are a result of big government, when in reality, all our problems are a result of the elite class, which is comprised of the consortium of big government and big business. I think that's very much how I see politics. It's inherently one the elite class versus the common man, and ultimately the elite class is going to try and divide the common man as much as possible, and it looks like they very much succeeded. But sadly, that's very much how life works. It's divide and conquer, and that strategy usually works, and I don't see it changing anytime soon. Next, we have Navy will remove sailors with medical shaving conditions after 1 year of failed treatment from Stripes.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the military subreddit. And yeah, personally, ultimately those U.S. military and anti-defense branches can remove members for whatever reason that feels like. That's ultimately how the state works. I personally wanted to always join the military, but I couldn't because I'm on SSRI. But ultimately the military can set whatever rules it wants to, and of course Reddit might not like it because of course they'll say, oh, this is just an attempt to remove black servicemen because they must be the ones with the medical shaving conditions. But of course, Reddit, they don't really care. I'm sure if it was the out group getting removed rather than the in group, Reddit will think it's the best thing ever. But I don't think it really matters. Ultimately it's the Navy's prerogative. They can remove whoever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. I would say from a libertarian perspective, you should want them to remove as many people as possible. The more people they remove, the smaller the force gets, and the less lives will be wasted. But when they do end up going to war, and if they ever do want to justify using the military against civilians, there'll be less military members to go against them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the sole purpose of MAGA is to loudly declare the rules that apply to others do not apply to them, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Murder by Words subreddit, and that looks like a tweet from Mike Masnick, who quote tweeted USA Today, who tweeted, the White House launched 25 Freedom Fuel gas stations, all selling fuel at $3.47 a gallon, and then Mike Masnick replied, same people promoting that are screaming about Mamdami's grocery stores as communism. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for either of them. I don't think the state should be getting involved with private industries, whether it be grocery stores or gas stations. I think that those are best handled by the market, not the state. But ultimately, the state's in a position where it can get its fingers involved in whatever it wants to. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it, since they have, the ability that they are in a position of state authority to pretty much justify whatever they want to. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have scrap it and start all over. Ex-Bush and Obama officials say the war on terrorist powers have gone too far, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think that this is, the pot calling the kettle black. I would argue the Bush and Obama administrations were even worse on the in expanding the war on terrorist powers than the current administration, and that's saying something. But it doesn't really matter. The government's just gonna expand its power regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't really matter what the reason is. The war on terror has been the predominant one this century, but there's always going to be some reason for them to expand their power, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it because people are just going to justify it when it's their side doing it and not the other side. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have support for capitalism falls a new survey from thehill.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think if you want to support capitalism, you should be able to. If you don't want to support capitalism, you shouldn't be forced to do so. Capitalism isn't perfect, but I do think it's probably the best system we have currently. But that being said, ultimately, I think if you want to practice capitalism, you're not forced to do so. You're free to live out in the woods in your communist utopia. But ultimately, I think each person should be able to justify practicing whatever system they want to. If you want to practice capitalism, they should be able to practice communism. They should be able to practice whatever you want to, as long as you don't force it on other people. Next, we have ICE agents fatally shoot unarmed Houston father for you. Panicked and mistook masked officers for intruders, from ibitimes.co.uk, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-posted to the underreported news subreddit. Yeah, personally, ultimately, just to show you the state can justify shooting you for any reason it feels like, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. They might be dressed in like burglar uniforms, but you might think they're burglars or intruders, as this guy did. But ultimately, it just goes to show you that it doesn't really matter what outfit they're wearing. They can justify doing whatever they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since the state controls the courts and legal system and always will try and look out for its own. Next, we have This Week on Hide and Seek. Ted Brown, Libertarian candidate for Senate in Texas, on age verification, App Store ID checks, and the road to a national digital ID, posted by VR Free R1F1 Free DONLY, and that's cross was from the VPNet subreddit, and that looks like a YouTube video from. Looks like it's no longer available, so I can't really tell you who it's from, but yeah. Ultimately, I do think that, government shouldn't be doing age verification, App Store ID checks, a national digital ID, but ultimately it can justify enforcing whatever it feels like. I think their current thing is we need to protect the children, and I think, if it's not the job of the state to protect the children, just like it's not the job of the state to protect anybody, we need to protect the children, and we need to protect women, are two of the big greatest reasons for government authoritarianism. Just because the state wants to protect people doesn't mean that you're not going to be giving up. You're giving up liberty. You can't give up liberty to ensure safety, even if it's for a marginalized group like women and children. And that's ultimately, I think, the libertarian position. I think if the state shouldn't be implementing age verification, App Store ID checks, or the rule or national digital ID. I think if private companies want to do that, I personally still wouldn't care for it. But ultimately, they're at least that's they're choosing to do it, not the state. And I think that's ultimately the big difference. If the state does something, everyone's going to be forced to follow its orders. If a private company does something, you're always free to start your own website, even if, it's still authoritarian, like in regards to stuff like Reddit censorship and the censorship of other social media websites. Next, we have Trump removes remaining members of the Federal Election Assistance Commission from Fox13Now.com, posted by Mundane Image 13, and that's cross-post from the conservative subreddit. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you that, people in positions of power can justify removing whoever they want from government positions, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Personally, I think it's all just theater, though. I think the president is a figurehead first and foremost, just like pretty much every elected official, and they're just really, and they do WWE stuff like this to distract from the fact that, they're not the ones running the show. It's really the deep state, military-industrial complex, satanic cabal, lizard people, whatever you want to call them. The true power, I would say, in government operates out of the shadows. We probably don't know the names of the people who are really making decisions that are running the show. But yeah, ultimately, it's just stuff like this that's distracting people, I would say. I think it's a good reason why you shouldn't have elections in the first place. Those in positions of government authority can inherently control them, and oftentimes might not be in agreement with them. And that's why I think if we are to have forced collectivist elections, we should have open ballot, so we should be able to easily trace who voted for who, rather than the secret ballot system we have currently, where it's very difficult to do that. Next, we have It's Not How Many Voters You Get, It's About Who's Counting the Votes, from APnews.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit, and that's the article entitled Trump fires, that's the Donald Trump House Election Commission members in latest push to reshape the U.S. voting process. And yeah, personally, I don't agree with the Sell on everything, but I definitely agree with that quote, it doesn't really matter who's voting, what matters who counts the votes, and what counts as a valid vote or not. Ultimately, what counts as a valid vote or not is going to be inherently subjective first and foremost. And that's important to remember. That's personally why I don't think we should have voting in the first place, because it's going to be inherently subjective what counts as a vote rather than objective. And just because one side receives the most votes doesn't make it good. Everything that happened, it's important to remember that, both Reddit Hitler, aka Donald Trump, and actual Hitler were democratically elected, and that doesn't mean that they were justified in all their authoritarian actions. Ultimately, I think libertarian positions, you gotta be against democracy. It's simply mob rule and tyranny in the majority. Just because it's viewed as this inherently great Western value doesn't mean it is. I would argue it's contrary to the ultimate Western value of individualism. Democracy is an inherently collectivist institution. The West needs to uphold individualism first and foremost, and that's why I would say the libertarian position is to be anti-democracy. Next, we have Senator Mitch McConnell's hospitalization proves again that gerontocracy sucks, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And Yeah, personally, I would say that I personally don't really care for the gerontocracy, but I personally think it's probably one of the better things that when it comes to democracy or democracy. It just goes to show you that the people of power are often gerontological husks who are clearly really not running the show, and that's very much how you got to remember that it's all just electoral politics is mostly just a farce and a WWE style distraction. The real power in Congress is the people you don't see, the unelected bureaucrats really making the decisions. Next, we have Plattner's Daniel Muraf, barred from Summer Lee's campaign over sexual misconduct complaints from PaydayReport.com, posted by PMJC2CA3, and they added, I wonder who they're going to blame for all of this. And yeah, personally, I think if they want to exclude people from their campaigns for whatever reason they want to, I think they should be able to. It's very much freedom of association. Next, we have Talarico continues attack on Paxton over child sex abuse plea deal from TexasTribune.org, and they added, and posted by Nietzsche, and they added, modern day Republican voters are truly more baffling than words can express. How can a party that identifies as Christian claim to be anti-abortion in order to protect children, and ETC not seriously not feeling shame and casting a vote for pedo sympathizers? And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, they're all a bunch of pedophiles. Red, of course, doesn't care for the red gang of pedophiles, and the Republicans and the red gang of pedophiles don't care for the blue gang of pedophiles. But I don't really think it matters whether they're red or blue. They're mostly just all a gang of pedophiles, and an Epstein class with a few select exceptions like Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, who I personally would disagree with economically, but I personally do think he's probably one of the better ones when it comes to being against the Epstein class and the pedophile protectors. Next, we have Lady Knows Her Rights and forces agents to back down, posted by Patom13, and that's crosswords from the This Is Fascism subreddit. Knowledge is power, science is protection, the right card speaks for you. Hashtag ICE, hashtag police, hashtag Constitution. And the OPAD, they just walked into her house because the door was open. Please get the right card and help spread the word. Fewer than 5% of detainees have any criminal record, but they're being forced to work for $1 a day and being tortured, the children being lost in some traffic. This is wrong. Please stand on the right side of history and humanity. And then they link to the page for red cards on irlrc.org. And yeah, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, ultimately, I don't know if these guys are actual federal agents or just cosplaying as them, but regardless, it just goes to show you that, the state can do whatever it wants to, and ultimately, it doesn't really matter if they're actual federal agents or not. What matters is they have the perceived authority of the state, and ultimately, I think libertarian positions do what the person here did, just because they think they have authority doesn't mean they actually do. You have every right to stand your ground, even if they're in supposedly a position of state authority, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have another attempt at a libertarian nation from BBC.com, posted by Patom13, and they added bets on its eventual success, and that article is entitled Meet the Crypto Billionaires Building a World Where Money Buys You a Vote, and that's a story, I think, on somewhere, I guess. I think maybe that... I don't know. I think that's maybe the Liberland they have between the disputed line between Croatia and Serbia, but I don't really know which for sure. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if they want to have an island or a country where money buys you a vote, I think they should be able to. Ultimately, the libertarian position is I think if people do want to start their own countries, they should be able to. That's very much the libertarian position. The libertarian position is support secession down to the individual level. If you don't like a country where money buys you a vote, you shouldn't be forced to move there. You should be free to start your own country. Ultimately, I think this is very much a case for voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. If you want to have a country where money buys you a vote and whoever rewards whoever gets the most money gets the election, you should be able to have that country. But some people might not like that, and I think ultimately we need to prioritize individual choice first and foremost. Ultimately, if we're up to me, each individual would have their own country. If they want to form collectives of multiple people into a country, they should be able to. But right now, you're pretty much forced to obey whatever the law of the country you're born in is, and oftentimes that's something that's very much forced collectivist. Especially when it comes to a country of the U.S., not all 300 plus million people can agree to everything the U.S. government and it does, whether it be at the federal, state, or local level. And that's personally why I think we got to have voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. Each individual should be able to justify doing whatever they want to, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. But sadly, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where the state can justify pretty much whatever it wants to, and the individual is just going to be walked over pretty much 24/7, and there's nothing they can really do about it, since you're not in a position of state authority and they are. Ultimately, it just goes to show you that just because someone's in a position of state authority doesn't mean you have to obey whatever they say. You have every right to stand your ground, but they ultimately have the monopoly on the justification of the legal use of force, and they control the courts and legal system as well. So oftentimes doing that can be kind of hopeless, though. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position, as I said, is each person should have their own system rather than we should have one forced collectivist system like we do currently. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.